Uh, mm, er, Filler words, pauses, linguistic nothings. These are things we mostly try to avoid. But for me, they're a mainstay of my speech. And while much of it is caused by a speech impediment, I use these moments of linguistic gap to instead convey meaning. And its cousins are an often unappreciated linguistic phenomenon. Treated as weeds like dandelions, we often pluck out these wonderful little gems from the garden of our vocabulary, when, with a little investigation, we'd find a plant that makes a lovely coffee. I'd like to present to you the future of a language I speak, consumed by filler words and linguistic nothings, and show you how something cursed can still be something quite beautiful. It started with a list of animals. Tarave, cockroach. Check. Flegel, bird. Check. Yael, mountain goat. Check. It went on and on from there. No, it doesn't refer to my conlang. It refers to my process of documentation of a conlang. The language is Djupara, the product of decades, over a century depending on what you count, of my family's efforts to make their own language. My name is Lelam. I am a second-generation native speaker of Djupara. And yes, this is my family's real language. I have been documenting the language on and off for years, although my work in the last year is my first time really ever seriously undertaking a thorough language write-up. And while doing so around a speech and social impediment that will go on to shape the language in a very funny way. For this year's Cursed Conlang Circus, I'd like to introduce you to Djupara, to my family, to the story of my history documenting the language, and, to fit the theme of a conlang being cursed, to the awkward and yet somehow lovable future I see for our little lect. I'll start off with just the history, not cursed on its own, just so you have context for how this language will progress into its cursed state later on. I grew up knowing my family was quirky. I had been told stories about how my family developed this language to communicate better with each other, and I knew that the language was unique to us. I, at the time undiagnosed, have autism and ADHD. One of my special interests is listing things. When I was 7 or 8, I got hyper-focused on listing animals. It was easier than saying them out loud, given my impediment. So I took out my notepad and a pencil. We didn't have a computer at the time. My parents were very late to the whole PC thing. And I got to writing. And writing. And writing. By the time my hyper-focus broke and I moved on to something else, I had amassed a small bilingual dictionary of over 100, poorly spelled, animals that my family had words for. This wouldn't be the last time I made a small dictionary like that. Nor was my attempt the first. Back in the 1950s, or 60s, my grandfather, well, okay, to you he was my second cousin twice removed, but my family uses epithets weirdly. Well, he made a small dictionary and also of a few hundred words in our language. I couldn't read it because, well, by the time I was born, almost the entire lexicon of the language, as well as our spelling conventions, had changed to the point of almost no mutual intelligibility. Djupara is originally a descendant of the Jewish language Ladino, or Judeo-Espanol, as we call it. We were a group of Ashkenazim living mainly in New Jersey and Brooklyn in the 1920s. Wait, isn't Ladino a Sephardic language spanning the post-Reconquista Jewish diaspora? Why, yes. So what were we doing speaking it? Zoom back to the 1850s. My family lived in a little shtetl in Poland. We were itching to leave. I think you can imagine why. One branch, and we don't know who was the first to go, we don't have the records from the time, moved to Argentina. While there, they learned the local Castilian Spanish. Soon thereafter, the War of the Triple Alliance displaced most of those who had moved over to Paraguay. Again, the details of how they were displaced and why they had to move to Paraguay specifically are lost to history. Of those who remained over in Poland, most eventually moved over to the United States starting in the late 1880s and on through the early 1900s. The tiny few who remained in Poland after that only had one child to survive the Shoah, raised by a local Christian family. My family hated Poland, so much so my grandmother told me, that her parents denied having even spoken Polish, despite her father having turned bar mitzvah in the old country. Paradoxically, as my grandmother recounted, her parents also didn't know Yiddish. So, Grandma, what did they speak? No one would say. Some of her uncles and aunts spoke a little Yiddish, but not her parents or grandparents. Upon arriving in the U.S., my family was itching to get in contact with their South American cousins. As luck would have it, they found a local Sephardi woman, Esperanza, who happily taught them the Judeo-Espanol. At the same time, those of us who did know Yiddish taught it to my great-grandparents and her first and second cousins. And like their Yiddish, they learned the Ladino poorly. Nearly every aspect of the language they attempted to learn was broken in some way. Not taking the challenge lying down, they wrote to their cousins eagerly in the Judeo-Espanol they learned, putting pen to paper and writing in the Latin script instead of the native Soletreo or Rashi scripts. They wasted no time re-establishing contact, and this is where the fun began. You see, my family learned Judeo-Espanol, but it was entirely anglicized. They had put so much effort into learning good English and broken Yiddish that stacking a Romance language on top of that was a struggle. But my family, having Jewish hearts, took this as an occasion for laughter. In the chaos of trying to converse with people on a different continent using a sister language learned hastily, they burst out laughing when they realized that their cousins were no longer speaking typical Spanish. Oh no, having lived in Paraguay for over a decade and working in rural areas with locals, they had begun to speak the local Djupara. Imagine my great-great-grandmother's surprise when their cousins wrote back, "Hablamos algo de avañé, eh?" Zoom back to me, writing yet another list of words in Djupara. My childhood was filled with such stories. Ironically, having started as a primarily written language to contact distant relatives, by the time I was born, Djupara was almost an entirely oral language. I'll get to why in a minute. But little speech-averse me found writing it all down natural. And where I needed to speak, I found ways around that difficulty. My speech had always been filled with far more filler words than everyone else. For me, these uhs and ers were not just one phenomenon. On the one hand, there was a cognitive difficulty remembering the words and stuttering over the ones I did remember. My family also helped with this by showing me some basic sign language to help me convey ideas, as well as to help me understand their speech when my ADHD and sensory issues caused my listening to not be able to catch up with their vocals. But there was another kind of reason, too. A social kind of reason. Often, filler words served as a way to subtly guide the conversation. An here or an there could signal outward uncertainty and therefore honesty. A slight pause or an in speech could signal thoughtfulness or care in word choice, while craftily covering for my inability to remember the actual word I was looking for. But be careful, an too long or in the wrong circumstance can also look like dishonesty, a lesson I had to learn many times. But what I lost in speech fluency, I made up for in vocabulary expressiveness. I couldn't easily get the words out, but when I did, they were usually complex. By the time I was in my early teens, I had been shocked that only one partial attempt had ever been made to actually systematically document our language. I asked why, and I was told that most of the speakers were in the U.S. now, hence the primarily oral nature of the language besides some light emails and Facebook DMs, and that the language was changing too fast to make documentation worthwhile. My urge to list things disagreed, though. So, taking pen to paper again, I started a new list. This time of every word I could think of. Two, to go. Man, a noodle or a face. Contrascène, a password. Ennui, boredom. I continue on for a few hundred words until, once again, my hyper-focus broke and I got stuck onto something else. But you may have noticed something. Two. Man, these sound distinctly Mandarin. And ennui? Is that some kind of French? Ah, yes. Years after my family began learning Judeo-Espanol and picking up their cousins' Djupara via postcards as a way to bridge the gap, controversies began to arise. Controversies about intermarriage. There had been controversies about this before. My grandmother and her cousins had gotten into trouble for having Italian crushes in grade school and picking up some of their Sicilian in the process. But this time, someone actually got married. My Aunt Naomi had gotten hitched to a fellow from China in the 1960s, my Uncle James. To help calm the family-breaking tensions, my great-grandmother, or Bubby as we call her instead of Bubby in the normal Yiddish meaning grandmother, began to drop some of his Chinese into conversation, both in her English and in the little bit of Judeo-Espanol that was spoken aloud at that point. A little intercultural olive branch, if you will. It must have worked, as over the decades the controversy died out, and in the 1980s another intermarriage happened, this time to my Aunt Fabienne from Haiti. Bringing in her Haitian Creole, actually significantly mixed with standard French, my family welcomed her by taking from her language just as we had done with Chinese. But this time it was a game, and everyone was in on it. By the time I was born in the mid-90s, we had a whole new language that had adopted tones, new phonemes, hybrid Sino-Germano-Tupi Romance grammar, and a whole bunch of new words. And just like the Judeo-Espanol and Yiddish of prior decades, their adoption of Mandarin and Creole was an absolute mess, full of errors and miscommunications. But that, my friends, was the fun. From the struggles to pronounce the Mandarin Q, to mocking each other's tones, to intentionally changing things that sound stupid, to petty arguments over verb conjugations, to the constant struggle to keep up with all the rapid and inconsistent changes, the whole point was to brutally annoy each other into laughter. I grew up in this era of the language, born 1996. So there I was, making yet another dictionary, this time in high school. Then I stumbled on something. A video on YouTube by NativeLang. Descriptivism versus prescriptivism. Then another video. Then another. I'm an introvert, so most of my hobbies are in obscure academic topics like this. That day, the word of the day for me was linguistics. Not just the words of the language, but the etymology and the sound changes, as well as the grammar, which I knew from birth wasn't the same in Djupara as it was in English, and specific elements of it like semantics and morphology. Looking back, I realized that, of course, I misunderstood most of what I read. I still struggle with actual real-world linguistics today because I'm still really a fish out of water. But I was undeterred by the difficulty. I opened up my notepad, but actually, the notepad this time was the Note app. We had finally caught up with the rest of the world technologically on my phone. And I scrolled to the top of the document to write an introductory section, and wrote down the list of languages that my family had cheerfully stolen from. Judeo-Espanol and Spanish, Guarani and Djupara, Yiddish and German, Hebrew, Haitian Creole and French, English, Portuguese, Italian, Mandarin, and even little drippings of Arabic and Japanese. My cousin played mahjong with her friends. Couldn't help herself. One new addition, however, was from the most recent intermarriage, Armenian, particularly the Western dialect. Perhaps now would be the time to give you just a brief overview of our language's features. The thing I will note is that the actual language is absolutely riddled with obtuse spelling cases and special cases and irregular grammar. If you tried to learn it, it would sound like it was made simultaneously by a bunch of, dozens and dozens of confused newcomers. It's probably because it was made simultaneously by dozens and dozens of confused newcomers. But here's just a brief sketch of some of the features. We have 5 tones. 5 plus a neutral. It is the 4 of standard Mandarin, plus a new tone, developed by my uncle as a joke to mock the tones, but which caught on because it was funny. And yes, we do have words that are distinguished by tone alone. La versus la, verb completion particle, which is la with no or neutral tone, versus la rising tone, it. T versus t, and emphatic yes versus to eat. Down versus down, to give a gift versus cinnabar. As for the grammar, we are broadly SVO, with excursions into SOV for some reflexive verbs and other cases. We have adjectives come after nouns, except for adjectives of Yiddish origin and some irregular adjectives, like primaire. We keep some nasal harmony from Guarani, but frequently ignore it. I ignore it most of the time, at least. We typically use postpositions instead of prepositions, like the suffix pe or me, as the suffix to mean in, at, towards, or so on. Ri means on top of, and also typically goes after the object of the sentence. There are exceptions to this, like the word zai, which specifically means inside and which is used mostly as a preposition. We have 3 sets of pronouns and default gender-neutral pronouns, which are always written with capital letters. So we have the Guarani pronouns cha, the, nyanda, hae, haequera, and pe'e, used for folks you are close to, like your family or close friends. And we have the Mandarin pronouns wo, ni, ta, woman, nimen, and tamen, used for folks you're not as close to, like a neighbor or a coworker. And we have the Judeo-Espanol derived pronouns yo, tu, le, vosotros, vosotras, and les or ellas. If you want to sound formal, you use these, or if you want to sound professional or very angry. We also have a distinction in writing between the lowercase le for inanimate objects and the uppercase animate le. You may have also noticed that we use vosotras close to the Castilian vosotros. In Spanish, this is called voseo, although we call it voswa. Funny enough, both Judeo-Espanol and Paraguayan Spanish use voseo and yeísmo, so we just adopted both features naturally. Adding to this, if someone wishes to be called explicitly by the binary pronouns he or she, well, we have them. Those are the pronouns él and ella as words, as well as nowadays the myriad of neopronouns that my spouse and I honor as well. For conjugation rules, we use a very reduced form of Guarani prefixes and suffixes like a, re, o, and so on, plus many helper words like yo and hui to convey tense, mood, and aspect. So we have te escrivi, I write. This can also be shortened to chascrivi. We do contraction sometimes. We have tamen hui o camina, they will walk. Le fue tu, singular they would walk. Now, this next part is more interesting than I have really enough time to talk about, but we made a 4th person pronoun just for fun. Yongren for one. It is a portmanteau of yon for one and the Mandarin igaren, and this pronoun actually has its own conjugation for verbs. Which leads me to my next point, how we handle numbers. We have a weird mishmash of Creole and Judeo-Espanol numbers. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 6 is the Ladino shesh, originally from Hebrew. And we have 7, 8, 9, 10, 7, 8, 9, 10. 11 through 15 are just the Ladino, with 16 through 19 being DZ plus the final numeral. So DZ5, DZ6, DZ7, and so on until 20. From there, the pattern is the Ladino tens place plus the final digit. But we also have some oddities for the numbers 1 and 2. Instead of saying un for one of a subject, you use the definite article yon or yun if it is one of numerous items. For 2 of an item, you use liang instead of da. Moving on, taking from Mandarin, we use several measure words to quantify nouns. Ge, ben, ju, dia, and so on. In relaxed speech, you can actually drop these measure words in certain occasions, such as if you have only one of something. Yon bet, a bed, unless you want to emphasize yon ge bet, specifically one bed. We also have a set of particles which can be used to express different degrees of certainty or to express a statement or emphasize new information. Here's just a few. Ba, ne, pico, pica, como. The last thing I'll mention here is a heavy borrowing of word phrases from Mandarin. Things like 就要, le, for is about to, or 因为, inna, for because, therefore. We also adopted certain features like putting the time of an event at the start of a sentence, which I believe did originate from Mandarin, although I could be mistaken, or putting country before city before street in an address. The year is 2023. The pandemic is over. Life is returning to some level of normalcy. And once again, my fingers are itching to document. But now I know a lot more about linguistics. Now I could say things like, here's our consonant inventory, and here's how we treat allophonic variation of vowels in different language family origins. Over the next year, while working from home and pretending to pay attention during corporate meetings, I began my first truly exhaustive write-up of the language, including thousands of words, their etymologies, word usage notes, grammar, translations of texts and songs, phonology, and pronunciation notes. Some words I never really could find any good etymologies for, though, mostly of allegedly Guarani origin, such as latsua and oro, nilugo, a roast, solgu, a womb, and so on. And this is where I am now, slowly slogging through the creation of this write-up as I now teach my spouse to speak the language, and occasionally posting questions to r/conlangs or the subreddits relevant to the languages of origin of words in order to better understand the little nuances of how our usages of those words differs from from other languages, given how many intentional changes and how poorly we learned each of these things in the first place. I frequently hit snags in doing this because of my difficulty recalling words, called anomic aphasia, not unheard of in ADHD. So even in English, I will frequently try to tell my spouse to get the thing. It's on the top of the shelf of the cold ice maker box machine, the fridge, the jug in the fridge. Lie to me. And this makes trying to document words in a language with almost no modern written accounts extremely difficult. That and trying to document grammar and phonetics isn't exactly easy for me. I am not a trained linguist, and I have a hard time understanding a lot of the topics I read, and frequently misunderstanding ideas. So I have to be very careful in documenting in order to not unintentionally confuse future generations. This leads me to the future of the language. What will become of my beloved Djupara? Well, currently, the language is in a steep decline. Since the 2010s, there have been few new children, several major deaths, children not being taught Djupara in favor of English, Hebrew, and Armenian, many relatives moving away, and general apathy, all of which have done quite a number on the language. On top of that, I am remorseful to report that petty infighting has unfortunately almost entirely alienated me from my family, cutting me off from the few dozen folks who still actively or passively use it. I won't go into the drama, but it was really severe and exploded badly, so I have not much to say in the matter. The language is not dead, not yet, but it is most certainly what I would call endangered now. Documenting the language has also become exponentially more difficult due to this alienation. Not only can I not go back and ask for words and the stories behind those words, but because of the chaotic nature of the way the language intentionally evolved, everyone speaks noticeably differently. I would love to record the nuances of how each person speaks, and the chaos also makes being able to pick up on the little subtle patterns that are consistent between speakers much harder to find without talking to them. I also just don't have access to a lot of old family recordings where I would have audio samples of the language spoken in active natural use to better describe the phonology and grammar. But what kind of language do I envision my own great-grandchildren speaking? Will it even still be called Djupara? When I am an 80-year-old geezer, out of touch with the lingo of the hip whippersnappers, maybe I will be the one struggling to keep up. But here's my best shot at predicting what might be. The year is 2076. My descendants have inherited some of my mannerisms, and perhaps some of them have also inherited my speech impediments and other disabilities. Being my and my spouse's offspring, and descendants of my quirky family in general, I can easily envision them being as socially awkward and hard of speech as their dear old bubby. And in their era of the TikToks and the AI-fueled social withdrawal and the use of filler words and linguistic nothings have taken over their language. One interesting feature that will also have developed, that already is developing, is animal and Pokemon sounds. Yeah, not a joke. My spouse's otherkin. I have been adopting their animal sounds into our language because, well, frankly, I miss the chaos. I miss the constant change and racing to keep up and the absurdity of it all. And if this makes my spouse feel welcome and at home in the language, then woof. Most of them act in a similar way to Mandarin, sentence final particles. So far, we have picked up on a few of these, like the Guarani pico getting a derivative pica, used as a non-specific question particle, purring with a rising tone as a sentence initial particle to indicate curiosity, and a short huff to indicate an interjection clause. Evolved originally somewhere between a laugh and a grunt to indicate a trailing thought or prevailing idea. In the future, I imagine our socially withdrawn children to heavily use pica, specifically, probably evolving into something akin to the English, in order to introduce a new idea. In the intervening 80 years, given our history of very diverse intermarriages, one of my children, by sheer coincidence, will have married an Aboriginal Australian. I say this not just to make this an even more of a kitchen sink lang than it already is, nor really to add cursedness, but just because I know my history and see this as a realistic outcome. In our speculative future, let's say that this new child-in-law of mine is from the Warlpiri nation. As per the perennial ritual of friction between spouses and their parents-in-laws, at first I won't like them, they won't like me, and the cycle of generations being mad at each other will continue. But it's my mishpucha, my family. I can't really hate them. So, carrying on the memory of my own bubby, I'll pick up on some of the Warlpiri language, extend the olive branch, but not just any Warlpiri words and grammar, no, meshing nicely with the filler words and indirect speech that evolved over those decades. We'll specifically use words from their avoidance register, often used between a spouse and their in-laws. And, of course, I will probably learn them incorrectly. We'll see the adoption of words like kuriji, a mother-in-law, mitipinyi, to leave, ngaya, forehead, irakari, a piece, a part, or a half, and wungumani, to see. But let's take a look at the less cursed parts of the language, just to give us some overview of the language. Over the years, our phonemic inventory will almost certainly have shifted, probably to simplify and further anglify. I expect our consonants to be b, ch, d, j, f, and then our current g or r, just simplifying to g, h, ch, just simplifying to h, j, k, l, m, n, ng, p, and then our Mandarin t or ch, just simplifying to ch. We'd also have our r and just simplifying to or just dropped at the ends of words. We'll have s, sh. Well, Djupara has a sh, but I expect that just to simplify and merge with sh. We have t, v, w, and z. Noting, as above, I am by no means a linguist, and that I am not really 100% solid on the nuances of IPA, so my notation could be off here. I have had years to learn it, but you know how it is. Now, our vowels I expect to undergo a major overhaul. In the current era, our nasal vowels have mostly been just consolidated to on, and I expect this trend to continue with one exception. We'll have a and on, e, our nasal becoming on again. We have a, I. Our current I will just simplify back to I. That's the one exception for nasal vowels. We have I, o, on, u, on, simplifying again to on. And we have the simplifying just to a schwa, a. As for our tones, expect also some simplification. I expect that we'll probably lose the and tones, but retain the neutral tone as well as and As for grammar, I imagine we'll probably see ko merge with and replace the inanimate l. We'll probably also keep the voshwa. Now for the cursedness. I expect that we will have lexicalized several vocal and non-vocal fillers. Our vocal fillers will be adjectival prefix for the use with nouns that don't have determiners. Diminutive noun prefix for use with a noun that has a determiner. Replacing the generic measure word g as well as yon and yun. Adjectival prefix for use with determiners. A sentence initial question particle, and a marker for names. The non-vocal fillers will include two kinds of pauses. A medium pause, such as in combination with zai, to mark prepositional or postpositional phrases, and the long pause, such as in the adverbial circumfix, long pause plus adjectival root plus or as a suffix to form an imperative. Here, the already exists in Djupara as a Mandarin in origin. We actually use it so frequently in our Djupara that, and also in our English, that English speakers we encounter say that we sound Canadian. Ultimately, we use it in the same way, Makes sense, eh? I also anticipate that the presence of several manual gestures in the language, carrying on with modification just a few of the sign language practices I will probably use with my children and grandkids to communicate with them. I expect things like head rocking as a marker for answers to yes-no questions, head shaking for negation, eyebrow raising for questions, hand raising as a marker for approximate quantities, and so on. Obviously, these won't come out in my audio, and the audio won't be unintelligible without them, but they'll be part of routine in-person conversation and are noteworthy in the evolution of the language. I will notate them here with little cringe emojis. Adding to this will be an extra emphasis on the use of a series of interjections, which will have gained extra grammatical use. Bene, followed by a medium pause, will be a marker for independent clauses. A marker for declarative statements. For consistency, I'll also tag along some existing interjections already found in Djupara. Doi, shi, ko, he, o, and ha. We'll also see the adoption of a verbal predicate jarku from the Alperi jaruku for speak, or in this case, allegedly. This is to be used for almost all verbs and was originally used almost as a filler word as a means to space out sentences and cause verbs to seem less accusative and impactful. So let's take a look at some of how our current Djupara phrases would translate into this socially awkward future version. Yon advent, a chair, would become a advent. Notice that the final R has been dropped. Le advent blanc, the white chair, will become advent blanc, where le has been replaced with ko, and the adjective blanc gets prefixed with a. For cultural reasons relating to shyness, the chair has been made diminutive with the prefix Mission, to mix, stays mission, but gets a verb connector when done by a pronoun. Ch mish, I mix, becomes ch jarku mish. Ta dink, they think, becomes ta jarku mish. Then we'll have con rapidement, which means quickly or rapidly, becoming rapid, with a pause at the beginning. And finally, le fue bene, it was good, becoming co fue bene. So finally, here we are, the end of the video. Let us finally see how our infamous Twilight passage looks in our little future Djupara. About three things I was absolutely sure. In para toi things fue jarku positive, First, Edward was a vampire. In a ben Edward fue jarku vampire. Second, there was a part of him. In a ben le jarku yo yirakari. and I didn't know how potent that part might be. In Jarku Bukwata Pogwasu ko Irakari nang Jarku Fuea, that thirsted for my blood. Ki Jarku yo Sedba Porchablud Pika? And third, I was unconditionally and irrevocably in love with him. Ha ina ditwa bene kicha jarku dai I kong halaba jarku meyo conditions ha afinque como jarku bunang a regresa. And you know what? If my descendants speak like this, fine. This language is meant to change, to grow with the times. Who am I to tell them how to speak? Is their speak Gen Delta cringe? Maybe some people would call it that, but not me. You speak who you are, and I would hope to know who my children are for who they truly are. That goes for you, too, dear YouTube patron. So my story comes to a close. Finally, after 100 years of life, I put down my language documenting pen and cozy up in my old little Jewish lady blanket and knit some baby sweaters. The language, if it continues to exist in future generations, is in their hands now. I hope they cherish it. Maybe a pet parrot escapes sometime and carries the echoes of our words to some jungle somewhere. Who knows? Oh, and as one final word, if any of my great-grandchildren happen to be watching this in 80 years, hi kids, Bubby loves you. Stay hydrated, do good in school, and don't drink and teleport, or whatever you kids are up to these days. Shalom.